Hello, welcome to another CleaveTech tech tip. Now today we might just finally get this motor all back together and running again. If you haven't seen the other videos on this journey of getting this motor back up and running, I'll put a link on the screen up here now. But basically we've stripped it down, we've cleaned it up, we've glued the magnets in, put a new bushing in place, and now we're all ready to reassemble the end bell. The armature has been Comtrued. I did that earlier in one of my videos, and it's now come back from balancing by Dave Harvey at 101 Slot Racing. I've got the pile of bits that I took off the end bell, I've got the brushes that came out of it, so let's get on with the job. So in a previous video I stripped this end bell down and removed all the brush gear apart from these two base plates on here. And really we need to ask the question, why are we actually rebuilding the end bell? Why does it need rebuilding? Well, let's take a look at the brushes. So here are the brushes that came out of the motor. And as you can see, they've not worn evenly. What we're looking for really, unless we're actually applying advanced timing on the motor, but that's in another video perhaps, all about timing of armatures, etc. and brushes. But unless we were going to try and change the brushes to advance the timing, then you can see these brushes haven't worn very evenly. You can see they're touching at the bottom, but they weren't touching at the top. So clearly they weren't aligned with the center of the armature shaft very well. Now, when we rebuild the motor, I want to align these brushes in the center so that they wear evenly, so that the commutator is, or the armature shaft is smack bang in the middle of these brushes. Generally that means that then the brush is going to wrap itself around the commutator more accurately, and you're not going to end up with maybe one brush too high or both brushes too high on the commutator and shorting out on the com segments, etc., and causing extra arcing and burning. So by lining them up accurately, we get a much nicer motor that's going to run more efficiently and hopefully be much faster. There is quite a lot of information when it comes to brushes and brush alignments, etc. I'm going to save some of that for my Tech Tip Extra series, which will be coming soon. I've been saving up quite a lot of Tech Tip Extras for that series. Extra! Where we go into a lot more depth over some of the issues on setup and stuff with slot cars, so keep an eye out for that in the future. So let's take another look at the end bell and these brush hoods that go in place here. So these brush hoods fit over these little protruding plastic parts here on the end bell. Now if I was to just refit them like that, then I'm limited to how I can align these brush hoods like this, because they would literally sit over that plastic and I couldn't do much else apart from sort of bend this brush hood a bit. But I want to try and make sure the brush hood is aligned nicely on both sides without having to worry about fitting it over these. So I'm just going to trim off these protruding plastic parts with a knife, so that it allow me to align the brush hoods where I need them to be. So I can just take a sharp knife like this and just trim them off so they're flush with the plates on the end bell. So I'm going to do that with all four of these, just making sure, you have to make sure there is enough plastic left to actually screw in the brush hoods and your spring posts, etc. But I know I'm not trimming off very much here, it's only a fraction. I can see the holes go quite deep into the end bell, so there's plenty of plastic left to do that. So I'm going to trim these off and I'll be back in a moment.
12 seconds later.
So I'm back and they're all trimmed off, so they're all nice and flush there with those end bell plates. And you can now see that the brush hood itself can just slide, and I can align that up wherever I want to without having to worry about it interfering with these plastic lugs on the end bell. So, but before I fit these and align these, I also need to have a look at how the spring is going to fit onto the brush. And you can see that if I put them around this way, which is the way I'm going to do it with the lead wires at the bottom and the brush springs at the top, then this little cutout here in the brush hood allows the hook of the spring to push the brush in, and obviously for the brush to have a fair amount of wear before the spring gets caught on the brush hood. But what I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to cut an extra slot in that brush hood there so that the spring can go even deeper along the brush. The brushes can wear even more before you need to replace them. So to cut those slots a little bit longer, I'm going to just hold the brush gear in a pair of pliers, and I've got my multi-tool Dremel here. It's actually a Proxon, brilliant tools. I'll put a link of where you can buy them in the description. So I'm going to get my little cutting disc, and I'm going to very carefully cut that slot there a little bit longer. Let's get it into focus. So I'm going to cut that slot a little bit longer. I'll finish the slot and then I'll come back and I'll show you the end result.
A few inches later.
So here is the end result. It was a little bit hard to cut it whilst holding it up in front of the camera, so that's why I had to do it off camera. But you can see that I've managed to cut this slot a little bit deeper than it was, so the brush spring can go much further into the brush hood. I've deburred the edges so that it's not sharp. I've also deburred them in the inside as well, so they're not sharp. You don't want to take it too far down because you still need some metal here to hold the brush hood in place and keep its shape. So don't take the slot too far down your brush hood. Also, again, don't take the slot to the whole width of the brush hood as well, because you do need something to hold the brush in vertically as well to stop the brush from wobbling around in the hole too much. So again, just a slot wide enough for a spring and maybe a shunt wire, and not all the way across. Now for the next stage, I am going to need a specialist tool, and this tool here I've had for quite a few years. You can see it's like a rectangular bar, and it's got a diamond coating on two of the sides, and then it's also got holes drilled sort of through the middle of the bar, and they should align nicely with the center of the bar. Now I have seen these are brush hood alignment tools. I've seen these from different manufacturers. I can't actually tell you where this one came from, possibly Coford. Maybe, again, if you know or recognize this tool, you could put a link in, or you can put a comment below the video and tell me if you recognize exactly what tool this is or what manufacturer this came from. But let's say I've had it quite a few years. It's very important that these holes are perfectly in the middle of the bar. Now this has got one obviously on the short face and the longer face, or the wider face, for brushes which are one way round or the other way round, vertical or horizontal brushes. Now I have seen some of these where the holes aren't actually in the middle, and that's just a disaster. You can't really use those very much at all. So again, make sure the hole is in the middle of the bar. But I'm going to need one of these. I'm also going to need a 2mm axle. Now the 2mm axle, I know, fits through my motor perfectly, and it slides nicely in the motor. There's no resistance because I did align the two bushings or bearings on the motor. If you remember, if you saw in a previous video, I put a link up here how I sorted this bushing here on the end, and it's a nice new fresh bushing. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the axle back, I'm going to put the bar through, and then I'm going to make sure the axle goes through that hole like that on the bar. So now you can see that the bar will actually rotate on that axle like that. And I'm going to use this bar to help me align the brush hoods so that the brush hoods are perfectly in line with the center of the armature shaft. So now that the brush hood alignment bar is in place, you can see that the brush hoods should fit over the bar like that. If they don't fit over the bar, then you might have to just gently reshape the brush hoods with a pair of pliers. I did them very, very carefully. They weren't too bad actually in terms of shape. I did have to straighten them out a little bit, but again, you could even use the undiamond coated end of the bar to help you shape the brush hood to the correct size. So this bar basically matches the size of a standard motor brush. I know some 16Ds come with much smaller motor brushes with different brush gear. In that case, you might need another bar, or it might even be worth replacing the brush gear for better quality brush gear, or brush gear that's more suitable for regular size brushes. But say this brush gear was already on the motor, and it suits the normal conventional size motor brushes that we use in most of our motors from Group 12s up to Eurosports. So with both brush hoods over the bar, you can see how by rotating the bar I can change the alignment of the brush hoods. This one's just a little bit loose on the bar, so I might just tighten that up with a pair of pliers in a moment. But you can see how you can change your alignment slightly, but the bar keeps the brush hoods, as I say, centered on the armature shaft. So when they're like that, I can then think about just gently screwing down the brush hoods so that they match the plates underneath and keep them aligned. So these are the original springs and spring posts that were on the motor. They're not great really, they don't tend to have a lot of pressure on them. They tend to sort of bend very easily and don't hold their shape. This one's actually not too bad, but they're fairly low quality springs. So I'm going to be changing the spring posts for, again, something that's a little bit more universal on motors these days. So I'm going to change them for the slightly larger spring posts, and we're going to put on a set of standard springs. This post has been used on another motor, but there's nothing really wrong with it at all. It will work fine. I've also had to just turn down the heads of these screws slightly to get them to fit into the brush post. So as you can see, that will actually go in that way, and then the head of the screw will fit down inside the brush post. On the old ones, the head of the screw actually ended up sticking out the top like that and made them stick out even further than necessary. So this time the head's going to go all the way in. So I'll probably trim a bit off the length of the screw, otherwise it will be sticking all the way through the end bell. So I've just loosely screwed that one brush post on. You can see that there's still movement there. I haven't tightened it all the way up. So I'm going to screw the one on the other side as well. I had to take about 2mm off the end of the screw to stop it from sticking out too far in the end bell, as you can see there. You can see now, so it only comes to the end of the plastic. It doesn't stick out any further. So let's put the one in this side. It's a little bit awkward to do, holding it up in the air like this. But remember, when you are screwing on a self-tapping screw, remember to always move it backwards until it falls into the thread that's already cut. Otherwise, you end up cutting a new thread. So I'm going to rotate that backwards until it just falls in. You'll just be able to feel it fall into that thread that was there before, and then you can tighten it all the way down. So let's go down like that. I'll need a smaller screwdriver to get right down to the end, although that is actually tightened up a bit. So just back that off a fraction. So you can now see that that brush gear on this side still moves. There's still a bit of play on there, and there's still a bit of play on that side as well. So now I can put the screws in at the bottom of the brush gear as well and get everything lined up before I tighten them down. So I've got all the 4 screws in place, and I've pushed the end bell onto the can the right way around. Notice there's a little cutout here that goes on the bottom. It's nice to make sure at this point that the axle slides nicely through the bushes still, and it should obviously slide through your bar, but if it doesn't, you can give it all a bit of a wobble like this. Give it a bit of a wobble just to make sure that it is nice and freed up and slides nicely. And then at that point you can tighten down all these 4 screws, and then your brush gear should be aligned nicely with the center of your motor shaft. Okay, so all 4 screws are in place and the armature shaft slides up and down nicely. If the end bell wasn't such a good fit in this can, then I would have put all the end bell screws in, or at least 2 opposite end bell screws in before I did all of this to make sure it was still all aligned. But because the end bell's such a good fit, all I have to do is just hold it in place with my hands and I know it's going to line up and it's okay and it's in the right place. Now before I remove the 2mm shaft and the bar, I'm just going to put a little bit of solder joining the two brush gear plates together, the brush hood and the plate underneath. I'm going to do it top and bottom just to solder them both together to make sure that they stay nicely in place and don't move. Again, you don't want too much solder so that it runs all the way around the plate. You just need to tack them together like that so they solder together nicely. You shouldn't really need any flux if it's all cleaned up nicely. If you're using, this is 6040 tin lead solder. It's quite old, I've had it quite a long time. But it's just normal sort of electrician solder. It works really nicely for most things. So I've soldered the brush hoods to the brush plates here and here, all nice and neat. So now it's time that I can remove the axle, and the brush alignment bar should be able to slide through the brush hoods like that. Now this diamond coating is quite useful on this because it helps remove any burrs that are inside the brush hoods that are likely to catch on the brushes. So basically I turn it around one way and I run it through like that, backwards and forwards a bit, and I turn it round like that and I do the same, and now it moves nice and freely through those brush hoods like that, and clearly has removed any burrs or anything that's inside those brush hoods, so the brushes should slide nicely in and out without burring or catching on anything. So the next stage is to space the armature correctly inside the magnetic field. Thank you for watching another CleaveTech tech tip. So in this episode you've learned how to rebuild the end bell a little bit, get your brushes lined up nicely, and we haven't quite got this far yet. You might notice the motor's actually running. Well, you'll have to wait till next time to see how I finish it all off and get it all running. But in the meantime, remember, please comment below if you know who manufactures this tool, or if you've got recommendations for any other brush tools, or if you've got tools that do the smaller 16D brushes as well. I'd like to know that, so stick that in the comments down below. And please remember to subscribe if you haven't done so already by hitting the big C. There's plenty more to come. Have a look at some of my other videos and we'll be back next time and I'll show you how I get this motor finished and running.